What's up everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we will be learning about adding and subtracting polynomials. First, let's start off by talking about polynomials. Polynomials are expressions consisting of coefficients and variables that include operations as well, such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. You probably should have learned about polynomials already, but let's just go over them real quick before today's lesson. So our first polynomial, we'll go over one polynomial example right now, and that's 4x squared plus 5x minus 1. And as we take a closer look at this, we see we have 4, 5, and 1 as our coefficients or our numbers of this polynomial. And then we have x squared and x as our variables. We also have plus and minus, our addition and subtraction, as the operations of this polynomial. So this polynomial in its three parts, the coefficients, the variables, and the operations, all come together to make it. And we have another example of a polynomial right here with 3, 7, and 8 being the coefficients or the numbers, and x squared and x being the variables, and the subtraction and addition being the operations. So these two are just two classic examples of polynomials, and in order to successfully understand today's lesson, you must understand what a polynomial exactly is. So now that we went over polynomials, let's move on to our actual lesson for today, adding and subtracting polynomials. Let's start off with adding polynomials. Here's our first example. If you look at this, you see we have two different polynomials. Our first polynomial being 6x squared plus 5x plus 9, and our second polynomial being 7x squared minus 5x minus 8. It's important to notice that both of these polynomials are in parentheses. Now, when adding polynomials or subtracting them, a good thing to start is by looking at the sign in the middle. We can see that the sign in the middle is an addition sign, which means we're going to be adding these polynomials. Now later on, you'll learn that it's just easier to remove the parentheses when there's an addition sign in the middle and just add the polynomials and simplify. But just for practice and to understand later on when we subtract polynomials, what I want you to do is pretend like there's a positive 1, like this, there's a 1 right here. And I want you to distribute this 1 to all three of these terms, to the 7x squared, minus 5x, and minus 8. So our next step, since we could just remove the parentheses of the first coefficient because we don't have to distribute anything to that, we'd have 6x squared plus 5x plus 9. And since we distributed our 1 to these three terms in this polynomial, we just end up with plus 7x squared, because positive 1 times 7x squared is 1. And then we do minus 5x, because positive 1 times negative 5x is negative 5x. And since positive 1 times negative 8 is just negative 8, we'd have minus 8. So this would be our first step when adding polynomials, to simplify to this step. Now we do something called combining like terms. And it's pretty easy to understand it by just looking at its name, combining like terms. So the first word of that is combining, where we just have to combine the like terms. And by like terms, we have to look at the variables and the type of numbers. So first of all, let's look at the x squared. If you look at this step, you see that we have two x squared values in this unsimplified equation, 6x squared and 7x squared. Now you notice that there's a positive 6x squared and a positive 7x squared. So you can just add those two together to simplify to 13x squared. When combining like terms, such as this 6x squared and 7x squared, these two are like terms because they have the same variable value, x squared. Now, when you combine these two terms, you don't change the x squared, but you add the coefficients together to get to 13x squared. Now, using this knowledge, let's move on from x squared to x. We see that we have positive 5x and negative 5x. Well, positive 5 plus negative 5 equals 0. So we could just cross out these two values. Now that we finished combining like terms for x squared and x, it's time to move on to the numbers. And we have positive 9 and negative 8. positive 9 plus negative 8 is just positive 1. So then we can simplify to 13x squared plus 1, which would be our simplified polynomial by adding these two polynomials together. Now let's move on. Our next example is x squared plus x plus 1 plus x squared minus 2x minus 1. Again, we see we have the first polynomial here and the second polynomial here. Now, it's easy to remember just distributing a positive 1 to all three of these terms in the second polynomial, but when there's an addition sign, there's no point. You can just remove the parentheses for each polynomial and just continue along like this. X squared plus x plus 1 plus x squared minus 2x minus 1. Conceptually, if you think about it, a positive times a positive is just a positive, so you can just bring down the positive x squared as is, and a positive times a negative is a negative, so you can just bring down the negative 2x as is, and same thing for the negative 1. So that's why you don't have to distribute the 1 all the time, every time, to these three terms, but it's good to understand the concept. So since we don't have to distribute the 1 anymore, and we know that we can just remove the parentheses and move on, it's time to combine like terms. Let's start off with our x squared. Well, we notice we have a positive x squared here and another positive x squared here. Now, if you think about it, these x squareds basically have a 1 in front of them. 1x squared and x squared are basically just the same thing. So then we would add 1 and we'd get 2x squared. Okay, next step. Once again, we just have an x over here, but we can put a 1 in front of that x because 1x and x are the same thing. And we'd have positive 1 plus negative 2, which is just negative 1x, which is the same thing as negative x. It's best to just put negative or positive x instead of positive 1x and negative 1x. Just leave it as x. Finally, we come to our numbers, which is just positive 1 plus negative 1, which equals 0. So those two would cross out, and we'd be left with 2x squared minus x when we add these two polynomials together. Now let's move on to subtracting polynomials. Remember how I told you to pretend there was a positive 1 here next to the addition sign and distribute a positive 1 to each of these terms? Well, that was important to know because you have to do the same thing with the negative sign, and it actually makes a difference. So since this is the first polynomial, we can just remove the parentheses for this first polynomial and just bring that to 3x squared minus 3x minus 3. But now we actually have to distribute this negative 1, which will change the values of these three terms. So negative 1 times 4x squared is negative 4x squared. So instead of bringing down this positive 4x squared and adding 4x squared, we subtract 4x squared because we multiplied the negative 1 by 4x squared. So now we have to do the same thing for the next term. Negative 1 times positive 4x is negative 4x. So once again, instead of bringing down the positive 4x, we'd multiply that by the negative 1 and bring down it as negative 4x. Negative 1 times negative 3 is positive 3, so we'd bring that down as positive 3. So that's why I told you about pretending there was a 1 next to this addition sign and distributing, because that's important to know when using subtraction. It doesn't make a difference when you're adding polynomials, but it definitely does when you're subtracting polynomials. Because you see how we changed this to the second polynomial from positive 4x squared plus 4x minus 3 to negative 4x squared minus 4x plus 3. Now we can just combine like terms and simplify even more. 3x squared minus 4x squared is just negative x squared. Negative 3x plus negative 4x is just negative 7x. And negative 3 plus positive 3 is 0. So those would cross out. And we'd have negative x squared minus 7x after subtracting these two polynomials. So it's important to understand the difference between adding and subtracting polynomials, because when you're subtracting polynomials, it does make a difference to the second polynomial. You don't always have to input the substitute in the 1 after the negative. You can just conceptually think about it, how a negative sign will make a positive value or term negative when you bring it down to the next step. All right, we have another subtracting polynomial equation. We have another subtracting polynomial example right here. So once again, we can just bring down the first polynomial, 2x squared plus 4x minus 7. And now, since it's subtracting polynomials, we have to distribute this negative sign over to the second polynomial, which would result in negative 5x squared plus 3x minus 4. Now we combine like terms, and we get, so since we see there's a 2x squared and a negative 5x squared, we combine like terms and get negative 3x squared. We see that there's a positive 4x and a positive 3x. We'd combine like terms and get a plus 7x. And we see there's a negative 7 and a negative 4, and we'd combine like terms and get negative 11. So this would be what we get after subtracting this polynomial from this polynomial. Now that we've understood the concept of adding polynomials and subtracting polynomials, I'm going to leave you guys to do one problem on your own. So if you want to do this on your own, just pause the video and try it out. And I'm going to go over it right now. So we see it's subtracting polynomials instead of addition. So this subtraction sign does make a difference, and we actually have to distribute it. So we can just bring down the first polynomial, 15x squared plus 30x minus 45. And then we distribute the negative sign, which would result us with negative or minus 30x squared minus 40x plus 50. And now we just combine like terms once again with the 15x squared plus negative 30x squared, resulting in negative 15x squared. Then we'd combine like terms with the positive 30x plus the negative 40x, would result in minus 10x. And finally, we'd combine like terms with negative 45 and positive 50, which would result in plus 5. So after we subtract the second polynomial for the first polynomial, what we get is negative 15x squared minus 10x plus 5. If you enjoyed this video or learned something from it, please drop a like, and share. Thank you.